George was sitting in his old armchair, looking out the window at the sunset. He was 75, and he could feel old age sinking in deeper and deeper. He still remembered the day he retired. It seemed to him that it would be the beginning of a new stage of life, calm and free from responsibilities and work. But now, sitting in his empty house, George realized that this freedom had become another source of loneliness for him. All of his friends who remained had long since moved to other cities or simply withdrawn into another world. His children rarely came to visit. They had their own families, their own problems. George was not offended. He always tried to be independent and believed that he could handle everything himself. But over the years it became harder. His knees were hurting, his back was often inflamed, and his arms didn't always obey. He could no longer lift heavy bags, work in the garden, or repair the electricity in the house. And then, one day after much thought, George made the decision that he needed help. It was not easy, and he was used to relying on himself, and it was very difficult to admit his dependence on others. But he had no other choice. He turned to a caregiver agency, and a few weeks later, Catherine came to his aid. And as she was 20 years younger than him, with a beautiful but slightly tired look. Her eyes seemed deep, but she carried some invisible stamp of care, as if the burden she carried was not only her duty, but her life. George noticed this the first time he saw her. "I'm here to help you," she said, with a smile that seemed to take away all his anxiety. George was naively grateful. He wanted to believe that everything would be okay, and in the early days it really was. Catherine helped him with cleaning, cooking, and helping in the store. Her presence gave him a sense of security. After a few days, George began to feel a certain relaxation. At first, he was worried that he would become a burden to this young woman, but Catherine tried not to let him feel that way. She was attentive to his needs, always putting on tea if he asked for it, or bringing him the newspaper in the morning. She immediately understood his rhythm of life and knew how to adapt to it. A harmony reigned in the house again, and George began to feel that he was not completely alone. Catherine was not only a help, she became like a friend with whom he could talk about anything. They would sit at the table and talk about everything: his youth, his family, politics, and the weather. Sometimes George would tell her about his wife, who had died a few years ago. He couldn't help but notice how dutifully Catherine listened, not interrupting or giving advice, but simply being there for him. George felt that every day Catherine became more important to him, and perhaps deep down he began to rely on her more than ever before. Her kindness, her attention, her ability to be there for him was something that became a new and unusual happiness for him. She even reminded him of his mother, who was just as caring and attentive. Although George sometimes thought about his children, he no longer expected them to support him. The children were far away, and their lives were becoming more and more complicated. They could not always be there for him. But it didn't matter, because he now had Catherine, who replaced many things for him. One evening, as George sat in his armchair, drinking tea and watching TV, his phone rang. It was a call from his son, Dan. George sighed and answered it, feeling the familiar excitement that these conversations brought. Daniel rarely called, and each call was like a moment for him when they could feel like a family again. "How are you, Dad?" his son's voice said. "I'm sorry I don't call so often." "How's your health?" George wanted to say that he was fine, that he had someone to support him, but it was hard for him to admit that he wasn't as happy as he seemed. He said, "It's okay, son, don't worry. I'm just getting a little old, but that's okay." But there was an invisible anxiety in his voice. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me," the son said and hung up the phone. George sat back in his chair, looking at the empty TV screen. Perhaps he was really used to being alone. But now he felt a little better. Maybe this was the moment when he could finally say to himself, "Maybe I'm not so lonely after all." But another feeling did not leave him, It was the feeling that everything was not quite as it should be. He couldn't understand why he was starting to trust Catherine more and more with each passing day, and why his heart started to beat faster when she entered the room. Was it just old age? Or was it more than just support? George pondered, but his thoughts were interrupted by a soft doorbell. When George opened the door, Catherine stood in front of him with a bag of groceries and a big smiling face. It was one of those days when she showed her caring in a particularly vivid way. As he was about to open his mouth to thank her, Catherine said, "I brought you your favorite soup. I hope you like it." But she was in her usual style, always with attention to detail, always caring. And it was this small habit that made George feel like he was not alone in this world. George realized that he was beginning to trust Catherine more and more. He couldn't explain why, but the feeling was real. He began to notice that she knew when he needed a little more rest, when he was in pain, when he just needed peace. She never asked him about his personal life, although he told her about his family, about the old days when life was different, when everything seemed so clear. A few months ago, George could not imagine that someone else would become a part of his home, his habits, his world. But now everything was different. Catherine was not just an assistant. She became his ally. She was his support, even more than he could have ever imagined. One evening, as George sat in his chair and looked out the window at the stars, he noticed something. Catherine had started spending more time not only with him, but also in his home. She didn't just help with the housework, she became his company. And it was more than just a job. "What do you think about us going away for the weekend?" Catherine asked him one day while they were cooking dinner together. Her question surprised George. Wasn't it a little premature? But for some reason, his heart responded to the idea. "We could go to that park where my wife and I always used to walk. I'll show you the place where we used to sit and just talk." George added, realizing that this gesture was not just for show. It was a step into the unknown, but very important for him. The journey that Catherine spoke of was a moment for George not only to step outside of his familiar surroundings, but also to really get to know Catherine on a new level. She wasn't as easy to help as she initially seemed. They began to share deeper conversations, and in each one, George noticed her character revealing itself more and more. She had a story of her own, as complex and painful as his. I lost my parents when I was very young," Catherine said one evening sitting by the fire. "I was alone, and I had to become strong quickly. A lot of what I do for you, I do because I want to help people not feel alone. I realize how important that is." For George, these words were a revelation. He realized that Catherine had more than just a desire to work. Her caring was deeply rooted, and now he could feel it at every turn. But at the same time, he began to notice that it was something he hadn't really expected. It was the beginning of a new connection, a new stage that changed everything, but which had not yet been defined. After a few weeks, as George and Catherine continued to spend time together, he began to realize that the trust he had begun to feel for her was not one-sided. Her eyes, her mannerisms, her body language were all a language that George couldn't help but notice. Something was changing in their relationship. When he thought of his wife, his heart became heavy. He was not ready to love again, not ready to start a new relationship. But Catherine left him with the feeling that it was not just help, but something more. Maybe it was just a deep emotional connection, but the thought that his life could be different was creeping in more and more. George stood on a fine line between acceptance and rejection. On the one hand, he felt that he didn't want to be alone in his old age, but on the other hand, he was afraid to open his heart again. He realized that this new emotional attachment could be a double danger, losing her or losing himself in her arms. Catherine appeared at the door again, this time with a bottle of wine. What do you say to an evening with no TV, no news, just the two of us?" she asked, and with that question once again, the last barrier George held was dissolved. What would happen next? He didn't know. But his heart told him that this was the beginning of something big. It all started with a small detail. George couldn't say why, but every day it became harder and harder for him to feel the carefree trust he had felt in Catherine before. I.e., that wasn't a big change, more of a feeling that came over him suddenly when he noticed Catherine not answering her phone. At first it didn't seem like anything important, but over time he started to listen more closely to his feelings. Catherine had always been so open, and now her constant absence from the phone made George feel insecure. She started spending more time out of the house, and sometimes when she came back, she looked tired, almost lost. Her being late for work wasn't unusual, but this combination of all the little changes started to raise questions that George didn't want to answer. One evening, as George sat at the table eating dinner, he noticed that Catherine looked particularly nervous. Her usual jokes and stories were short, and her eyes, which were usually so confident, suddenly became avoidant. If she didn't ask about his day, didn't ask how he was feeling after his last visit to the doctor. And that was the first time George noticed that her usual caring had somehow subsided. "Catherine, are you okay?" "Anna?" he asked, breaking the silence that had been between them like an invisible barrier. She immediately turned her head and answered vaguely, "Yes, I'm fine. It's just been a hard day." Her answers began to seem more and more alienated to him, and her attitude more and more reserved. She used to be happy to share her feelings, but now her words and actions were suddenly unfriendly. This made George wonder if he really knew the person who now often appeared in his house. Every moment, every word began to cause anxiety that he had never experienced before. Soon, George began to ask himself if Catherine was hiding something important from him. He began to think about the past, about the moments when he was younger, about the people he once loved, and how things had changed over time. He remembered his wife more than once, and even mentally compared her to his current situation. After all, life often changes, but one thing has always remained the same: the people we trust can be the source of the greatest disappointment. George began to watch Catherine more and more closely. He recalled several moments when she would accidentally seem to forget certain things they had talked about earlier. For example, she couldn't remember where she had put his medical records, or how she couldn't remember when he had told her about his appointment with the doctor. Every day, his suspicions began to grow, and he began to think more about what might be behind her behavior. Could it be just emotional fluctuations? Or perhaps Catherine has some secrets of her own that she doesn't want to reveal. One evening, as George was sitting in the kitchen checking papers, he heard the sound of a phone ringing. It was her cell phone, which was on the table next to him. It was on, but Catherine was not home. George, and forgot about his doubts for a moment, but when the call came again, he felt his heart beat faster. He looked at the phone screen and saw an unfamiliar number. George remembered how Catherine had told him a few days ago that her phone wasn't working properly, that it needed to be repaired. He could not understand why she never left a message about who was calling when he was away. Her reaction to the phone calls became strange, and the feeling that her dishonesty was beginning to reveal itself gripped him. George decided not to wait any longer and take matters into his own hands. He waited until Catherine returned and decided to talk to her openly. But when she entered the room, he did not remain silent. George's gaze was serious and determined. "Catherine, who was that on the phone?" he asked, jolting her out of her usual state of calm. Her gaze first became confused and then hid. She looked away and answered, "It's nothing important. Just an old acquaintance." But her answer sounded so tentative that George felt his heart clench with worry. What was behind these calls? Was it just a misunderstanding or something more? George didn't know, but he couldn't ignore what he was feeling any longer. Doubt, anxiety, and distrust filled his soul, and a question haunted him. What is really going on? George could not shake the strange feeling that began to haunt him. Every look Catherine gave him, every gesture she made seemed to hide a secret. He realized that he could not just continue to live in ignorance. He decided to find out more, to figure out what was really going on. And no matter how hard he tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, his suspicions began to grow like a snowball with each passing day. Those unfamiliar calls that he couldn't ignore became part of his daily routine. They called whenever Catherine was out of the house, and whenever she returned, she would try to quickly put out any questions that arose. She smiled and talked about minor things, but George noticed that her eyes were less open, more protective. Her every movement looked like she was trying to hide something. "I've asked you several times who called, Catherine. Why won't you tell me?" His voice was firm, but inside he could feel his heart beating faster. For the first time, she seemed uncertain, and her gaze was lost, and that momentary weakness he had noticed left almost no trace as she quickly regained her confidence. "It's just an old friend from work." "Don't worry, George. Okay, you know I have a lot to do," she replied, but this time her words were not as convincing. He no longer believed her as he had before. Moreover, every time she tried to distract him from the topic, he felt even more alienated. Why was this particular secret so important to Catherine? What could she not say? What was the role of these calls in her life? George decided to take the next step. He decided to find out what Catherine was hiding. It was hard, but more and more he felt that he couldn't just walk away from his doubts. So one day, when she went out again for a few hours, he stayed home. His heart was beating faster when he picked up her phone, which she had left on the table. He knew it was wrong. But was it wrong if he needed to find the truth? His fingers slowly tapped the screen until he saw calls and messages from an unfamiliar number. As he looked at the screen, George felt a wave of anger rise. He felt even worse when he saw the date and time. These calls couldn't have been a coincidence. George was not an investigator, but he felt that with every step he was getting closer to an answer he did not want to know. He was shattered because until a few weeks ago, this phone number hadn't raised any suspicions. Now that he realized it was systematic, George felt betrayed. But by whom? His wife. By his own thoughts. He didn't know. If he had any doubts before finding this number on his phone, they were now even stronger. His inner voice told him that there was more. Why didn't Catherine tell him about these calls? And why did she try so hard to hide them? Over the next few days, George became more and more observant. Catherine continued to come home late without answering his questions. She tried to divert his attention from it and said she was just tired after work. But George couldn't ignore the anxiety that wouldn't let go of him even for a moment. What was happening outside the house that was important? And why was Catherine becoming more and more withdrawn? Every day these questions became more and more irrelevant. All these secrets became so unwieldy that he felt as if they were tearing him apart from the inside. And no matter how hard he tried to put it behind him, the answer was inevitable. One evening when he came home early, George came across another detail. Catherine was absent again, but had left her bag on the table. On this time he couldn't resist and decided to look in her bag. And that's when he found another piece of the puzzle, a printout of financial transfers. It was a small amount, but they looked strange for someone who had only a few $1,000s in her account. This newly discovered fact made him even more suspicious that what was happening was much more serious than he thought. Was it just a mistake? Or did Catherine have plans that she didn't want to reveal? George was even more confused, but he felt that his life was changing inexorably. His hand trembled as he realized that the next day could be the day everything changed. George sat on the couch, his eyes never leaving his phone. All his attention was on the message that had appeared a few minutes ago. He read it again, trying to figure out if it could be just a coincidence. "I'll meet you tomorrow, as agreed. You know what to do." It was a message from the same number he had found in Catherine's phone. His heart fluttered again. He felt that this was the moment to act, and although his mind told him that it could be dangerous, he couldn't take it any longer. George decided that if he was going to find out the truth, he had to do it today without putting it off until tomorrow. Knowing that Catherine would be home from work in a few hours, George prepared for the conversation. He had to be ready for any development, whether it was a confession or a denial. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was ready for the first battle, a battle for his trust, his family, and his soul. Catherine came home, as usual, with a cold look on her face. She undresses and puts her bag on a chair as if everything is normal. George sits in the same position he had taken before she came home. Although his heart was full of anxiety, but he tried to stay calm even though it was hard. Every second was dragging on like a minute. He could not turn away from this topic, could not leave everything in the past again. "Catherine, we have to talk." His voice sounded firm, even though he could feel his entire mind shaking with fear. She raised her eyebrows, then, silently, sat down in a chair. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. She felt something. She knew that this question could not be put off. "What's wrong, George?" Her voice sounded slightly calm, but it smelled of uncertainty, as if she was trying to come up with an answer that would satisfy him. "I found a message on your phone, from the same number, and I want to know who it is. What are these calls you're hiding?" George couldn't keep quiet any longer. Everything that had been building up inside him spilled out into one big question. Catherine flinched and then quickly closed her eyes. George noticed her face change as anxiety, denial, and fear mingled on her expression. It's not what you think it is," she said with almost complete certainty, but George could sense that her words didn't have the ease with which she usually spoke them. She was trying to avoid a direct answer. "Are you saying they're just friends? That I'm making it all up?" He felt his voice getting rougher. He couldn't stop now. All these questions that had been tormenting him for weeks were bursting out, despite the fact that he was trying to remain calm. "It's more complicated than you think." You don't understand, George." Catherine looked away, as if trying to find the words to explain the invisible barrier that had appeared between them. Her answer was not convincing. George could no longer hide what he knew. He felt that she was trying to manipulate him, to manipulate his emotions. His thoughts began to muddle. Those messages, her looks, her anxiety, it all became too obvious to be a coincidence. But it wasn't enough. Pool, if it's not what I think it is, then why can't you tell me the truth?" His voice was full of frustration. Catherine looked him straight in the eye and then said, "It's hard for me to explain everything to you. I don't know if you can understand." These words broke his heart even more. George felt the crack in their relationship grow deeper. Why can't she just tell him the truth? And if this truth is so painful, what is she really hiding? In that moment, George felt he couldn't hold it any longer. He took a step toward her, but her restraint and silence pushed him away even more. "You've been lying to me all this time, and now you want me to just accept your words. No, Catherine. It's over." The blow made her gaze even colder. She didn't know how to respond to his accusation, and although George hadn't yet realized the whole truth, he felt that he could no longer trust her. The shadows of doubt that had been lurking in his soul had now become a reality. It's not over, George," she said, and although her words were meant to be reassuring, they were an even greater sign that they no longer had the connection they had before. They sat in silence, and each felt a huge gap between them. It was as if the last thread that had kept them connected was slipping from their hands. George knew that this was only the beginning of a great battle, and he could not just give up. That night George could not sleep. His thoughts, like crazy trains, raced along the track, not stopping, not letting go. He got out of bed and quietly, so as not to wake Catherine, went out to the balcony. A cold wind ran through his hair, but he didn't feel cold. His heart was beating so fast, as if it was trying to escape from what had happened between them. George looked out at the city. which seemed to continue to live its normal life, despite the fact that his own world had collapsed. And the feeling of disappointment and betrayal was so strong that he felt as if a whole storm had passed through him. It was hard for him to accept that Catherine, the woman he once loved, could so easily betray his trust. "Ah, this is not what I imagined," he muttered quietly under his breath. "This is not what I wanted." But now that he was on the brink of breaking off their relationship, he realized that he couldn't just turn back the clock. This was the point of no return. Catherine had been avoiding talking to him directly for days. She kept her distance, as if trying to avoid confrontation. This made George increasingly doubt whether there was any truth in what she was saying. What were these messages she was keeping quiet about? How long had she been hiding something like this from him? He sat in the kitchen, waiting for her to return from work. His heart was beating hard, because he knew that this would be his last chance to dot the I's and cross the T's. Today he would not give her the opportunity to run away from the answers. He had to find out the whole truth. The time that passed while he waited only increased his anxiety. George was not ready to simply accept her choice. If he realized that he didn't resolve this situation today, nothing could be fixed. Their love, their trust, all of it was gone, and he could not return to this dark labyrinth where there was no more room for light. George decided that this meeting should not end with anything but a frank conversation. He felt that if he allowed her to manipulate the situation again, he would lose himself. Then, when Catherine crossed the threshold, her face was the same as always, cold, reserved, as if nothing had happened. George noticed how her eyes avoided his. She knew this meeting would be crucial. "Catherine, we have to talk. Can't we put this off any longer?" His voice was calm, but it was already full of determination. He couldn't stay silent any longer, couldn't live with this lie between them any longer. She sat down quietly in a chair, her eyes averted again. She knew that her time had come. There was no more avoiding the conversation. "George, you don't understand." Her voice sounded distant, insincere, as if she were trying to find an excuse for what had happened. "It's not what it seems. I was trying to protect you. I didn't want you to find out." But you still tried to hide it, Catherine. You lied to me. You lied to me all this time." He raised his voice, and his heart was beating faster and faster. He felt like he was no longer in control of his emotions. "We both made mistakes." Catherine tilted her head. "But I didn't mean to hurt you. I just couldn't tell you the truth. It was too hard." George sighed heavily and closed his eyes. His mind raced like a storm, trying to figure out if this was a real betrayal or a mistake that could be corrected. But he was no longer sure of either. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," he said, his words woven with pain, disappointment, and fear. "I can't just forget all this and go back to the way things were. It's too deep." Catherine remained silent, her face unmoved. But George could see that even if she wanted to try to make things right, she had already lost him. The loss of trust is a line from which there is no return. Catherine left him in silence. George was left alone. He realized that today he had really reached the point of no return. There is no more chance of recovery, no more possibility of returning to what was. This was the end point, the point where everything changed forever. He began to realize that he could no longer turn back the clock. His choice had been made. And even if he hadn't been ready for it, he had already taken the first step toward a new life that could no longer be avoided. It was not just a conversation. It was a step into a new reality that George could no longer change. All his doubts, all his fears had now become reality. But the bigger the gap, the clearer one thing became: he couldn't live with this lie. And although his heart still ached, he realized that he was no longer the same. Now it was a fight for his own survival. George sat in his office, scattering documents across his desk as if trying to organize everything that was falling apart in his life. He had the look on his face of someone trying to figure how he got into this situation, But each new look at the numbers and bills only made his condition worse. That morning he received several calls. The first was from the bank. George, you need to urgently address the issue of overdue payments. We can't wait any longer, the caller said. The second call was from a financial advisor who warned that his pension fund was on the verge of collapse due to serious investment mistakes. And the third call was from a lawyer informing him that his lawsuit against Catherine was not yet over and he needed to prepare for trial. Each of these calls was another blow to him. He had long since given up hope that he could get out of this financial hole. Just a few years ago, when things still seemed stable, George could have afforded to even think about the future. But now he felt like a shipwrecked ship at sea, where every wave only made things worse. He had always dreamed of a peaceful retirement, of days when he could enjoy every moment without stress. He dreamed of traveling, of spending time with his family, of being able to help his children and grandchildren, and not be burdened with debt. However, these dreams now seemed to him to be just an illusion, leaving only emptiness. Why didn't I see this before? He wondered as he reviewed his situation again. Most of his savings were invested in bad projects, and now he was losing almost everything. The loss of his deposits, the deteriorating situation with his pension funds, all these little things were adding up to one huge financial disaster. George began to remember all the promises he had made to himself when he first opened his retirement account. How many times he had convinced himself that he had everything under control. You're not alone. You've worked your whole life. You deserve stability, he told himself. But now that Catherine had taken most of his money, leaving him at the mercy of circumstances, those promises looked like empty words. It was his own fault for not seeing the danger in time. And now he had to pay for his inattention. It was hard not to think about what had happened between him and Catherine. They had both shared the financial burden for many years, but after his wife began to hide financial transactions and secret debts, it became clear that she was no longer the person he knew and loved. Actually was like a shadow slowly absorbing the light. Could all this be a coincidence? He repeatedly asked himself. All these problems, all these debts, all this hidden money that Catherine used for her own purposes. Or was it all part of her plan? Or was she just not good at managing her finances? Or maybe it was part of a bigger betrayal. Now George was facing what he had been dreading for so long. His old age, which he had dreamed of spending in comfort, no longer had the future he had envisioned. All those great plans he had made with Catherine were now shattered. It wasn't just a financial collapse. It was the destruction of his hopes for the future. The worst part was not even that he could lose everything, but that he had already lost everything. Lost ideas, lost hopes, and that the money that had seemed like a solid foundation was now turning to dust. But there was one more question that tormented him. Was it possible to restore at least some of it? Was there still room for hope? George sat surrounded by a pile of papers, but now his attention was focused on one document, the new financial statements. He had to find a way to cut costs, at least partially, to have any chance of survival. Different ideas were running through his head, but none of them seemed convincing enough. What was left of his life? Each of those calls and each document became a real lesson for him. George realized that the sense of security he had felt in his youth was now just an illusion. He could no longer live in a world where money determined everything. Now he was faced with the task of remaking his reality, of finding a way to stay above the surface. But would he be able to find a way out of this financial hole, or would he remain at the very bottom? In the end, George realized that the hardest thing is not just losing money. The hardest thing is to lose yourself, to lose trust in other people and in the world around you. And at that moment, sitting in an empty office, surrounded by bills, he realized that the struggle was just beginning. Now he had to find a new path, at least part of what he had lost, and regain control of his life. But George felt the weight of the world falling on his shoulders. What more could he lose? His financial ruin, his broken relationship with Catherine, and the loss of almost all his savings were all part of his new reality. It was getting dark outside his office window, and he could only see blurry silhouettes of the outside world. But there was another question in his mind. Is a beginning possible after this end? It had been several months since his life had changed. George felt that these walls surrounding him had become even more cold and empty, or they seemed to squeeze him, reminding him of the mistakes of the past and the impossibility of fixing what had already happened. What did the future hold for him? The end of what he had, or a new chance? He sat on his old couch, looking at the bills and thinking about how he could start again. Having worked for many years, he had never learned to give himself room for mistakes. And now that everything had fallen apart, he realized how difficult it was to rebuild even the smallest part of his life. 3 months ago, he met Jennifer, and as she worked at a local cafe, and their conversation eventually became much more than just a casual acquaintance. Jennifer was young, full of energy, and it seemed like she could bring a new wave to his life. George realized that his emotional state did not allow him to make the right conclusions, but in her eyes he saw something he had not felt for a long time, real attention. Over the course of several weeks, George and Jennifer began to communicate more and more often. She became closer and closer, and with every word she said, George felt a little less alone. He even began to believe that this could be the opportunity he had been waiting for. But was it really a chance, or just another momentary feeling of comfort? But there was one question that haunted him. Is it worth trusting another person after all the betrayals and losses he had experienced? He couldn't trust his brother anymore, and everything had been decided with Catherine long ago. And now George is questioning whether it is even worth opening his heart. All these questions were circling in his head like birds that cannot find a place to rest. George sat in his dark office, listening to the soft sounds from the street. The dusk made everything even more dramatic. He could feel the bitterness of loss that filled his soul begin to consume even the last vestiges of hope. Was a new beginning possible? Or would it be just another stage in the long history of his defeats? Every move toward a possible new life seemed too difficult. George's decision was not just a matter of who to be with or what to do. It was a question of his own identity and how he wanted to live his life. Is it worth rebuilding what has already been destroyed? He asked himself. After all these years of doubts and struggles, what was left? Wouldn't it be another step backwards instead of moving forward? And is there even a new beginning after you've lost everything? George thought again about money. It had seemed so important once, but now he realized that it could not bring back what he had lost. Perhaps there is something more important than finances. Perhaps the chance for a new life is hidden in people and in the little things we usually don't notice. Over time, George began to feel that his life was taking on new colors. Step by step, he began to build new relationships. Communicating with Jennifer became important to him, and although he couldn't completely dispel his doubts, he felt that it was really worth moving forward. He began to enjoy simple moments, again walks in the park, a cup of hot tea in a cafe, conversations with people he knew. But would this new phase be a real beginning, or was it just an attempt to fill the void? George still had no answer to this question. Every day he realized that life would probably not be the same. And even if he found a new purpose, would he be able to truly forget the old pains? It seems that this is no longer just a choice between the end and the beginning. It is a struggle not to lose yourself, even when everyone around you seems to be a traitor. The silent betrayal of my caregiver's theft left me struggling in retirement. Them silent betrayal, and a booming caregiver's theft left mem struggling in retirement. The silent betrayal. My caregiver's theft me struggling in retirement. 要经历过这苦中无力净土 今年广告端传着完全快位，朋友圈这跨着广告都他今天奇怪，了快能看到那个么酷就都有样的记，然后这么拿看到都做头推，见等他访客狗狗给他钱了真这么开，纯净都做努掌控就都找努进体。Aduia twin pate, thono nanchen poil, one take them no river katu quanamo, tunman the way, woiling jay, one of my we till do with loo. Ada don't will be up at that one who knew by down the artisan do it down and do to the nendo kato not new render line hado gato banang di jing lindu. The silent betrayal. My caregiver's theft left me struggling in retirement is an emotionally charged story about the betrayal of trust experienced by a retired man when his own caregiver steals his savings, leaving him in a difficult position in his old age. The story shows how financial destruction through betrayal can change a person's entire life. It is not only about money, but also about trust, fear, helplessness, and the struggle for dignity.